The story begins with a massacre carried out by a mercenary force known as Fire Wind, led by Qualic. They were a band of hired soldiers driven by profit, hunting down and killing kung fu masters. It was revealed that the royal court had outlawed martial arts among its citizens, fearing rebellion. To enforce this, the king had issued a decree promising gold and silver to anyone who could eliminate these warriors. Unexpectedly, this decree became the motivation for Yilong and her comrades to slaughter the martial artists. Shortly after, the soldiers showed no mercy, eliminate both young and old masters alike without discrimination. After each killing, Yilong and her troops marked the fallen warriors with wooden plaques, as proof required by the kingdom to claim their reward. However, all the plaques were stolen by a martial artist named Qinju. Without hesitation, Yilong ordered her men to capture him. Surprisingly, Qinju was not only a master of kung fu, but also incredibly cunning in combat. Despite his exceptional skills, Qinju seemed reluctant to harm anyone. After a prolonged struggle, he managed to escape. In response, the Fire Wind troops scattered to search for Qinju, and one of them ventured into a forest. At that moment, Yilong's subordinate encountered a woman named Yuani, who was riding her horse by the riverbank. The soldier then demanded to know if Yuani had seen a martial artist hiding nearby. But Yuani refused to answer, prompting the soldier to attempt to kill her. Just as he was about to strike, Qinju suddenly appeared and engaged him in combat. Unfortunately, Qinju was struck by an arrow fired by one of Yilong's men and collapsed. Meanwhile, Yuani tried to fight back, but she was no match for the seasoned mercenary. Luckily, Qinju regained his strength and intervened, ultimately defeating the soldier and saving Yuani. Grateful, Yuani took Qinju to Yi village, where she lived with other villagers. At that moment, she tended to his wounds as a gesture of gratitude for saving her life. As Yuani nursed him, Qinju warned that the Fire Wind troops would soon descend upon Yi village and slaughter everyone. However, as he spoke, a villager named Don Luo erupted in anger and attacked Qinju. Don Luo accused Qinju of being a ruthless enforcer for the royal court, recalling how he had once tortured him and other martial artists deemed rebellious by the king. At that moment, Qinju admitted to his past crimes, but insisted that he had changed. He expressed his desire to atone for his sins by protecting the villagers from the impending attack by Fire Wind. Unfortunately, the villagers were skeptical of his words and refused to trust him. Not long after, Qinju was about to be executed by the villagers, but fortunately, the village chief, Jinyi, intervened just in time. It turned out that Jinyi wanted to interrogate Qinju first. He then ordered a young man named Jiban to imprison Qinju and guard him. Meanwhile, Yuanying was determined to save Qinju from punishment. She believed deep down that he was a good person. To secure his release, Yuanying sought help from her close friend, Yufeng. It was revealed that Yufeng was the daughter of Chief Jinyi and also Jiban's lover. Yufeng agreed to help and immediately persuaded Jiban to secretly release Qinju. That night, Jiban smuggled Qinju into a horse-drawn cart. Afterward, he bid farewell to Yufeng, promising to return soon. Jiban and Yuanying then set off quietly, determined to take Qinju to a safe place. However, it wasn't long before Jinyi and the villagers discovered what had happened. They were furious with Yufeng for helping their prisoner escape. Meanwhile, Qinju urged Jiban and Yuanying to return to the village and evacuate the villagers to a place called Heaven's Mountain, where they could seek protection from the martial artists there. Not only that, he also warned that the Fire Wind troops were indeed coming. Despite this, Yuanying explained that the harvest season was near and the villagers would refuse to leave. Elsewhere, the Fire Wind troops had just captured a group of Korean immigrants, stealing all their belongings. During this raid, the bald general of Fire Wind, Hong Lei, made his presence known. Hong Lei was a feared leader, and no one dared to approach him, as his breath reeked of horse dung. Hong Lei then summoned one of the kidnapped girls, Jinzu, to be his concubine. It was revealed that Hong Lei was drawn to Jinzu because she resembled a former concubine of his. He took her to his chamber, claiming he would feed her. But his intentions were far from innocent. Soon, Hong Lei began to force himself on Jinzu, until one moment, one of his soldiers barged in without permission, interrupting him. Enraged, Hong Lei killed the soldier on the spot. Back at the village, another group of Fire Wind soldiers was spying on Yi village, counting the number of villagers. Apparently, the soldiers were planned to slaughter them all, as they were suspected of practicing martial arts. Meanwhile, Zhibong, Yuan Ying, and Qingzhu were resting on a snowy hill. To ward off the cold, Zhibong and Yuan Ying huddled together for warmth. However, Yuan Ying felt uneasy, knowing Zhibong was Yufeng's lover and her own close friend. As they rested, a massive fireball suddenly streaked across the sky and crashed nearby. The impact triggered a snowstorm, sweeping Zhibong and Yuan Ying away in the fierce winds. Fortunately, they were rescued by an elder and his disciple, Yinshou. To their surprise, Qingzhu recognized them as legendary martial artists from Heaven's Mount. At that moment, Qingzhu immediately pleaded with Yinshou to help the villagers of Yi village. Not only that, Yuan Ying also begged for their assistance, desperate to prevent another massacre. Unfortunately, Yinshou refused to get involved, as the risks were too great. He was also one of the martial artists targeted by the royal court. However, the next day, the elder and his 4 disciples decided to lend their aid. The elder bestowed 2 sacred weapons upon Zhibong and Yuan Ying, enabling them to join a fight against Hong Lei and his forces. To Zhibong, he gifted a massive sword named Daidi, while Yuan Ying received a double-edged sword called Heavenfall. Meanwhile, Yinshou summoned one of the elder's disciples, who had been meditating in a cave. The disciple's name was Zhaonan, known as the eldest and strongest of the Heaven's Mountain warriors. After Zhaonan emerged from the cave, the elder presented Qingzhu with a sword of his own. The elder urged him to leave his past behind and focus on redeeming himself. With that, Zhibong, Qingzhu, Yuan Ying, and the 4 martial artists set off for Yi village. Meanwhile, Jinyi and the villagers were holding a trial to judge Yufeng. Despite being his own daughter, Jinyi showed no hesitation in sentencing her to death if she was found guilty of helping Qingzhu escape. However, as the trial proceeded, the Fire Wind troops launched a sudden attack. The villagers scrambled to form a defensive formation, but the assault left many dead. Eventually, Jinyi and Yufeng found themselves surrounded inside a building, awaiting execution. Just as all hope seemed lost, one of the Heaven's Mountain warriors appeared. It was Longzi. Without a word, he drew his star sword and began cutting down the Fire Wind soldiers. Soon after, another warrior joined the fight, Mu Lang, the wielder of the celestial sword. Together, they fought with breathtaking skill and ferocity. Moments later, Yinshou and Zhaonan also stepped in to assist their juniors. As senior warriors, they wielded the legendary dragon swords, their power unmatched. Shortly after, Zhibong, Qingzhu, and Yuan Ying joined the battle as well, turning the tide against the Fire Wind troops. In the end, the mercenaries were utterly defeated. Despite this, Qingzhu spared one soldier, ordering him to deliver a message to Hong Lei. The sword-wielding warriors would be waiting for him. After the fight, Yufeng was overcome with grief as she surveyed the fallen villagers. Her sorrow was interrupted when she noticed Zhaonan drinking the blood of the slain Fire Wind soldiers. He explained that it was a way to rid oneself of fear in battle. Unexpectedly, Zhaonan offered her a bowl of blood and urged her to drink it even though the taste was unbearable for Yufeng. Meanwhile, Jinyi and the surviving villagers expressed their heartfelt gratitude to the warriors who had come to their aid. As the night grew late, the 4 Heaven's Mountain warriors invited Zhibong, Qingzhu, and Yuan Ying to join them in planning a counterattack against Hong Lei and his forces. With this, a group of 7 warriors was formed. In short, the 7 of them decided to act swiftly before Hong Lei could muster an even larger army. Around the same time, Hong Lei received the devastating news that his 300 soldiers had been slaughtered by these 7 warriors. Enraged, Hong Lei couldn't comprehend how just 7 martial artists could defeat his highly trained troops. Not long after, one of his soldiers reported that Qingzhu had requested a meeting with him. Hong Lei agreed and soon found himself face-to-face with Qingzhu, who was accompanied by Zhibong and Yuan Ying. It was then revealed that Qingzhu and Hong Lei had once been friends, but their bond had long since shattered. At that moment, Qingzhu warned Hong Lei that if he did not surrender, the 7 warriors would annihilate his entire army. Feeling insulted, Hong Lei launched an attack, and a fierce sword fight ensued. However, the clash was short-lived, as the other Heaven's Mountain warriors had already set fire to Hong Lei's base, including the granaries storing their food supplies. They also freed the hostages, throwing Hong Lei and his troops into chaos. Meanwhile, Xiaonan crossed paths with Yilong. At that moment, Yilong challenged him to a duel while mounted on her horse. Unfortunately, Xiaonan managed to slash Yilong's abdomen. At the same time, the other warriors were still locked in combat with Hong Lei's soldiers, buying time until the situation was fully under control. Back to Xiaonan's fight. Now cornered, Yilong threatened to kill Jinzhu if Xiaonan continued his assault. But in a flash, Xiaonan drew his sword with lightning speed, striking Yilong's neck and killing her instantly. After eliminating Yilong, Xiaonan turned to Jinzhu and spoke to her in Korean. At that moment, Xiaonan told Jinzhu that she was now free from Hong Lei's grasp. This enraged Hong Lei even further. To make matters worse, most of their horses had been lost, leaving Hong Lei and his men unable to pursue the 7 warriors anytime soon. Elsewhere, Zhibong tried to coax Yufong into intimacy, but Yufong confessed she wasn't ready. She also admitted that there was another man she had feelings for. Zhibong grew furious and threatened to kill this rival, but Yufong assured him that the man she spoke of was no match for Zhibong. He was far too powerful to defeat. Meanwhile, the villagers were busy with a massive harvest. They worked quickly, determined to finish before the Firewind troops could attack again. Amid the chaos, Yuan Yin was visibly frustrated, struggling to control the sword gifted to her by the elder. Seeing her struggle, Yincheng finally agreed to train her. Shortly after, Xiaonan returned with Zhanzu in tow. He allowed her to rest, but first shared that he too had once been a slave. Because of this, Xiaonan urged Zhanzu to leave her past behind and start anew. That night, Hong Lei and his men arrived at a village. It was revealed that the 7 warriors had set traps, but Hong Lei avoided them all. After scouring every corner of the village, his troops found it completely deserted. Unbeknownst to them, the villagers had already fled to a safer location. During the journey, Xiaonan suddenly halted the group. He gathered the 7 warriors and revealed that there was a traitor among them. Someone had been leaving markers along the path, allowing Hong Lei to track and attack the villagers. After a tense discussion, suspicion fell on Jinzhu, the outsider. However, Yufan was the only one who treated Jinzhu with kindness. She even offered her some corn, ensuring the Korean woman had something to eat. Yufang then noticed a handkerchief belonging to Xiaonan in Jinzhu's hands. She asked if Zhanzu had feelings for him, but the language barrier made their interaction awkward and unclear. As they struggled to understand each other, Yufang suddenly began convulsing. The villagers grew even more suspicious of Zhanzu, and Don Luo accused her of poisoning Yufang. Fortunately, the warriors remained level-headed. At that moment, Qingzhu explained that the river water was naturally toxic due to an overgrowth of wild plants. To prove his point, he urged the villagers to test the water themselves. Meanwhile, Xiaonan tried to calm Jinzhu, who was visibly panicked. He took her to a nearby hill and promised to escort her back to her homeland once the current crisis was resolved. That night, Hong Lei and his men closed in on the villagers' location, but they didn't attack immediately. Instead, the soldiers returned to their base to retrieve cannons. Meanwhile, the 7 warriors caught the unmistakable stench of Hong Lei's foul breath, signaling his proximity. Realizing the danger, Qingzhu suggested that the villagers hide in a nearby cave. They were to release their slower horses and keep only the fastest ones to avoid any delays. This task was entrusted to Zhibong, who was in charge of managing the horses. At the same time, Hong Lei sought help from a duke named Pai Lu. He requested additional cannons and reinforcements to bolster his forces. On the other hand, the villagers were guided into the cave to hide from Hong Lei's impending attack. As the warriors began their search for the traitor, Yuncheng caught a villager attempting to pickpocket him. Enraged, Yuncheng confronted the thief, and soon Don Luo intervened, leading to a heated brawl between the two. The commotion drew the attention of the villagers. Chief Jingyi, embarrassed by the incident, apologized to Yin Sheng, who graciously accepted. Later that night, Yuan Ying approached Yin Sheng as he rested. She then opened up about her dark past with Jingyi. It was revealed that when Yuan Ying was a child, her father had been accused of treason and eliminated by Jingyi without evidence. This event had left Jingyi burdened with guilt toward her ever since. Meanwhile, Zhenzu grew increasingly anxious, fearing for her life. Xiaonan comforted her, assuring her that everything would be all right. The two grew closer in the moment, and Zhenzu decided to share a secret about Honglei's base. She revealed that whenever Honglei acquired loot, he stored it in a giant statue-shaped vault. Intrigued, Xiaonan proposed a daring plan. They would sneak into Honglei's base while he was away and steal the valuables, leaving him bankrupt. Zhenzu agreed, and the two set off at the base. Upon arrival, Xiaonan wasted no time in smashing the giant statue. Unfortunately, their luck ran out. Honglei and his men were nearby and immediately launched a cannon attack on Xiaonan and Zhenzu. In the chaos, Zhenzu was gravely injured. In the dire situation, Xiaonan tried desperately to save Zhenzu, but he was ultimately captured by Honglei. To make matters worse, Honglei's soldiers seized Xiaonan's legendary dragon sword. Meanwhile, Zhenzu attempted to return to the cave to warn the others, but tragically, she succumbed to her injuries and died from blood loss. As a result, Yin Sheng deduced that Xiaonan was being held at Honglei's base. Without hesitation, Yin Sheng and the other 5 warriors rushed to the base to rescue Xiaonan. However, as they left, the entrance to the cave suddenly caught fire. Jingyi suspected this was the work of the traitor, so he ordered Yufang to secure the children while he pursued the betrayer. Later, Jingyi and his guards then engaged in a fierce battle in the darkness. Surprisingly, the traitor was revealed to be Don Luo, as he overpowered Jingyi and proceeded to slaughter the villagers. He then cornered Yufang, leaving her with no escape. Meanwhile, the 6 warriors arrived at Honglei's base. At that moment, they found Xiaonan imprisoned in a cruel contraption. His chains were tied to the legs of a horse. If the horse ran, Xiaonan's body would be torn apart. This torture was Honglei's punishment for Xiaonan's perceived role in Zhenzu's death. At that moment, Honglei demanded that the warriors surrender their swords in exchange for Xiaonan's life. While the others reluctantly complied, Yuan Ying refused. Unexpectedly, Yuan Ying launched a daring attack on the Fire Wind troops, sparking a full-scale battle. The other warriors quickly reclaimed their swords and freed Xiaonan. Once liberated, Xiaonan joined the fight, and despite being outnumbered, the 7 warriors effortlessly cut through Honglei's forces. Yuan Ying, in particular, had grown remarkably skilled with her sword. Meanwhile, Yin Sheng confronted Honglei at his throne, challenging him to a duel. Yin Sheng then remembered his master's words. His sword was no less powerful than Xiaonan's dragon sword, which Honglei now wielded. Confident, Yin Sheng faced Honglei without fear. Their duel was intense and epic, but Honglei managed to trick Yin Sheng and escape to another location. Fortunately, Xiaonan arrived just in time and pummeled Honglei with his bare hands. Xiaonan then borrowed Yin Sheng's sword to finish off Honglei and reclaim his dragon blade. He was also eager to end the fight quickly, as Honglei's foul breath was becoming unbearable. In the end, Xiaonan succeeded in killing Honglei and retrieving his sword. After eliminating the remaining soldiers, the 7 warriors returned to the cave, only to find a devastating scene. Nearly all the villagers had been slaughtered, leaving only Yufang and a few children alive. It turned out that Yufang had managed to kill Don Luo to save the children. However, she was deeply shaken, as she had never taken a life before. Fortunately, Zhibong was able to comfort her. Meanwhile, Xiaonan decided to cremate Zhenzu's body and scatter her ashes on a nearby hill. Shortly after, the warriors made plans to attack the royal kingdom, determined to prevent further massacres of innocent villagers. Moral lesson from the story: if you're trying to redeem yourself for past crimes, don't wait until everyone wants to execute you. Start earlier, like before the angry mob shows up. And remember, if someone offers you a bowl of blood to drink, just say no and run.